Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis. Today we're going to really dig into this book by Philip Hook. It's called Modern, 10 Years of Genius and Madness That Changed Art Forever.
Ooh, that title.
It really grabs you, doesn't it?
Right.
And it kind of gets at this question we always seem to be circling back to. Is there something there? A link between, real creative brilliance and mental illness?
A classic question. And Hook dives right in. I mean, right off the bat, he throws in this story about a German museum director who thinks he can snag this super valuable collection, all Renaissance art, for a steal.
Oh, no.
Yeah, totally misjudged the situation, though. American tycoons were entering the art scene at this point, and they were ready to drop serious cash.
It's like the whole art world was transforming, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about it. Those old masters, the ones everyone had always worshipped, suddenly they were commanding these insane prices.
And it wasn't just museums in the game anymore, right?
Exactly. You had these new collectors, these American tycoons flexing their wealth and shaking things up.
And it's all happening while this new generation of artists is basically saying, yeah, we're done with the old ways.
Right. Impressionism, which had been, this radical movement at one point, now it's over, finished.
And these young artists are like, time to break free.
Yeah, release control. That's how Hook puts it. It was all about instinct, rejecting all those stuffy traditions.
Okay, so how does this play out? Where do we even begin to unpack this idea of releasing control?
Well, we got to look at the giants, right? The ones who cast this huge shadow over the whole period. Van Gogh, Gauguin, and Cézanne.
Okay, so not directly part of this new wave. I mean, they're mostly gone by 1905.
Yeah, but their influence, man, it was massive.
Like almost mythical, right?
Exactly. Take Van Gogh, right?
Yeah.
There's this exhibition of his work in Dresden in 1905. And artists like Erich Heckel, they're blown away. I mean, his raw emotion, the way he used color, it was revolutionary.
And then there's Gauguin. Basically turns his back on Europe and heads for the South Seas.
Embraces what was considered primitive, you know, rejects the whole European art scene. And this feeds directly into the whole Primitivism movement. You've got artists like Nold and, what was his name, Pechstein, following in his footsteps.
Looking for something authentic, untainted by, Western civilization.
Right. It was more than just rejecting Europe, though. It was also about, finding new ways to see and represent the world. And that's where Cézanne comes in.
Okay, so how does he fit into this?
Well, his approach to form and space, it basically laid the groundwork for Cubism. Artists like Derain and Vlaminck, they were obsessed with Cézanne. There was this big Cézanne retrospective in 1907.
Yeah.
And it basically sent them into an artistic crisis.
So they're inspired, but it throws them for a loop.
Totally. Cézanne was breaking everything down. He was all about geometric forms, planes of color, didn't care about traditional perspective or realism.
So he was getting at the essence of things, the structure underneath it all.
Yeah. And for guys like Derain and Vlaminck, who were coming from a more traditional background, it was a total mind bender. The rug had been pulled out from under them.
So we've got this perfect storm brewing. The art market is going crazy. You've got these massive figures like Van Gogh, Gauguin, and Cézanne influencing everyone. And a whole generation of artists is ready to explode.
And explode they did. Cue the isms, right? Fauvism, Expressionism, Cubism, Futurism, each one trying to outdo the last, to break free from the old rules, push boundaries.
And maybe blur the lines between genius and a little touch of madness along the way.
Which is what we're talking about today, right? The Mad Genius Thesis. That link between incredible creativity and, maybe not being entirely normal.
Right, so as we dive into these movements, we got to keep asking ourselves, do we see that connection? Does the art reflect some kind of inner turmoil?
Exactly. Let's start with Fauvism, those wild beasts of color. Led by Henri Matisse, their big debut was the 1905 Salon d'Automne. And wow, did they make a statement?
I bet. Vivid colors, simplified forms.
Critics lost their minds, called it an orgy of pure tones, accused Matisse of painting with dynamite. Sounds a little unhinged, right?
Definitely dramatic.
But here's the thing. People often miss the technical skill behind Fauvism.
Yeah.
Yeah, they use color in this bold, almost shocking way. But there was a real understanding of color theory there.
Okay, so it's not just random splashes of color.
Nope. Look at Matisse's Lux, Calme et Volupté from this time. He's still using those dots of color, like the pointillists, but it's bolder, freer. He's pushing boundaries, but there's method to it.
So like a calculated risk, right?
Exactly. Pushing the limits, but with control.
Okay, so we've got Fauvism with its in-your-face color. What about Expressionism? That seems to go even deeper, right? Like into the darker side of things.
Oh, absolutely. Expressionism is all about emotion, angst, that inner turmoil. We're talking about artists like Kirchner, Heckel, Schiele, Kokoschka, Meidner. Often, their lives were pretty chaotic, intense.
And that intensity comes out in the art.
Oh, yeah. Think of Meidner's cityscapes, all jagged buildings being consumed by fire and chaos. It's like this vision of urban alienation. Or look at Schiele's portraits. Those twisted bodies, the eyes that just pierce right through you. It's unsettling but captivating at the same time.
Yeah, there's a vulnerability there, but also something kind of disturbing.
Right. And then there's Kokoschka.
Mm-hmm.
His relationship with Alma Mahler, talk about drama. She dumps him, and he tries to replace her with a life-size doll.
Okay, that's a whole other story.
Yeah.
But it definitely speaks to the intensity of these artists' lives, doesn't it?
For sure, these expressionists weren't afraid to explore those raw emotions, even the dark, uncomfortable ones. And their work, yeah, it can be disturbing, but it also has this incredible power. It forces us to confront those same emotions in ourselves.
Like they're holding up a mirror saying, hey, this is part of life too.
Exactly. It's a rejection of the idea that art should only be pretty or idealized. It's about capturing the whole human experience, the messy parts too.
Okay, so we've got this explosion of color with Fauvism, raw emotion with Expressionism, both pushing boundaries, challenging the old way of doing things, but then boom, Cubism comes along and completely shatters everything.
Cubism. Picasso and Braque, those guys were playing a different game altogether. I mean, think about Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. That painting started a revolution.
It's considered the first truly Cubist work.
Yeah.
And I've heard it caused quite a stir when it debuted in 1907.
Stir is an understatement. 5 nude women, all broken up, angular, those faces inspired by African masks. It was like nothing anyone had ever seen before.
Yeah, you can't ignore that African influence. It's so central to early Cubism.
Right. And it's interesting because Picasso wasn't the only one drawn to African art at this time. There was this growing fascination with non-Western art forms. People were realizing that these cultures had different ways of seeing and representing the world.
And the European artists were like, whoa, this is something new.
Yeah, the expressiveness of those African masks, the way they distorted the human form, it was a revelation. And for Picasso, it became a key inspiration for Cubism.
So he wasn't just trying to be shocking. There was a real artistic purpose behind it.
Oh, absolutely. Cubism was about breaking down the world into its basic geometric forms. They wanted to get rid of traditional perspective, the idea that a painting should show things exactly as they appear to the eye.
So it was about showing multiple viewpoints at once, like deconstructing reality.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that in those early years, Cubism was this very private language that Picasso and Brecht developed together. They basically withdrew from the public eye, working in isolation, experimenting.
Creating their own little artistic world.
Exactly. And while they were quietly revolutionizing art in their studios, another movement was emerging, one that was all about noise and grabbing attention. The Futurists.
Ah, yes, the Futurists. All about speed, technology, making a splash.
Right. Led by this guy, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti. Total showman. They love to provoke.
Didn't they even write a manifesto about it? Something about a new beauty, the beauty of speed.
That's the one. They were obsessed with the modern world, the energy, the chaos of the machine age. And their art, it reflected that. Think about Boccioni's The City Rises. It's this crazy jumble of forms capturing the frenzy of urban life. Or Balla's dynamism of a dog on a leash, a dachshund practically vibrating with speed.
So they were trying to make the canvas move to reflect the energy of modern life.
Exactly. And they did it with this incredible boldness. Some people loved it, others were horrified, but one thing's for sure, they knew how to push buttons.
Okay, so far we talked a lot about the guys, Matisse, Picasso, Braque, the Futurists. But where were the women in all of this? Were they just muses and models, or were they making their own art?
It's complicated. This era definitely saw a shift. Women started to emerge as artists, critics, collectors in their own right. But the old power dynamics, they didn't just disappear. It led to some, well, interesting relationships.
I'm thinking about Fernande Olivier, Picasso's partner during his early Cubist years. Her diaries give us this amazing inside look at their relationship. And it wasn't always pretty. Picasso was known to be, shall we say, possessive.
And Fernanda wasn't just sitting quietly in the background. She had her own ambitions, her own creativity.
Right, this was a time when women were starting to demand recognition, to be seen as artists and intellectuals, not just muses.
And that shift, It added to the feeling of upheaval that characterized this whole era. It wasn't just about art. It was about society, gender roles, everything being questioned and shaken up.
A time of radical change, exciting and terrifying all at once.
Exactly. And as these avant-garde movements became more and more radical, they started to alienate the public. The gap between artists and regular people just kept widening.
And with that alienation came this, like, obsession with darker themes. Death, suicide, a sense of impending doom.
Think of Munch, of course, the master of anxiety. But even artists like Derain, Boccioni, they talked about suicide, this feeling of being on the edge. Derain actually predicted that Picasso would end up hanging himself behind Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Pretty dark stuff.
Wow, that's intense. It's like they were living on the edge in every way, pushing themselves creatively and maybe pushing their own sanity, too.
Yeah.
And creating this art that was groundbreaking but also deeply unsettling.
Right. And that unsettling quality, that willingness to confront the darker side of humanity, it's a big part of what makes this era so fascinating. These artists weren't afraid to show the world as it really is, with all its beauty and ugliness.
Yeah, it's not always easy to look at.
Yeah.
But it's powerful. It makes you think.
Exactly. And on top of all that, let's not forget the drama. Because artists, well, they can be a dramatic bunch. As these movements gained momentum, there was so much competition, rivalry, backstabbing.
Oh, yeah. Hook calls it studio gruffness. I love that.
Right.
Like the Die Brücke group, those German expressionists, all those big personalities clashing. Kirchner, the self-proclaimed leader. Pechstein, the master of self-promotion. Their relationship was a powder keg.
Totally. And then you've got the Blaureiter, with Kandinsky and Mark trying to figure out abstraction while others are hesitant. And the Futurists, always stirring the pot, challenging everyone. Their relationship with the French Cubists was fascinating. A mix of admiration and rivalry.
It's like they were all trying to one-up each other, be the most radical, the most innovative.
And they would do anything to get ahead. Fudging dates on paintings, destroying early works, rewriting history to fit their narrative.
Malevich, Leger, Gris, they all did it. It's like they were trying to hide something.
Right.
What didn't fit into the story they wanted to tell.
That's a good question. Maybe something for our listeners to ponder. Because we're really just scratching the surface here. But there's this other layer to all of this. This wasn't just about artists being, difficult or competitive. It's like the whole world was changing around them.
Oh yeah, this is the machine age, right? Everything's speeding up. Cars, planes, the Eiffel Tower. Everyone's obsessed with technology.
Exactly. And artists are trying to figure out how to capture that, that energy, that speed, the feeling that everything's in constant motion.
And nobody embodied that more than the Futurists.
Right. They were obsessed with speed. They literally wrote a manifesto about it.
Something about the world's magnificence has been enriched by a new beauty. The beauty of speed. A little over the top, maybe.
Maybe, but you can feel the excitement, right? The sense of possibility that came with all these new inventions.
And it wasn't just the Futurists. Think about Delaunay, Leger. They were incorporating the modern city into their work. Those skyscrapers, those geometric shapes.
It's like the art itself started to mirror those changes, becoming more fragmented, more abstract.
And that push towards abstraction, it was happening everywhere.
Yeah, on multiple fronts. We talked about Kandinsky and the Blaureiter, their journey into the spiritual side of art. But there were others who were really interested in pure painting. Art that wasn't about representing the physical world at all.
Like Mondrian, Malevich, those guys were all about boiling art down to its essence. Lines, shapes, colors.
It's amazing, right? They were redefining what art could be, pushing it to the absolute limit.
So we've got these radical art movements, the world changing at warp speed, this growing gap between artists and the public. But who was actually buying this stuff? Were these artists just starving in their attics?
Well, that's the thing. There was actually a market for this new modern art. Not a huge one, but a small group of collectors emerged, people who really got what these artists were doing.
People like Gertrude and Leo Stein.
Exactly. They were huge supporters of Picasso and Matisse early on. Their apartment in Paris was like this hub for the avant-garde.
And then there were the Russian collectors,
Yeah.
Shukin and Morozov. They had these incredible collections of Impressionist and Post-Impressionist art.
Matisse, Picasso, Gauguin, you name it, they had it. And these weren't just tucked away in some vault. These masterpieces were hanging in their homes.
It's crazy to think about. They were true visionaries, willing to take risks on art that most people thought was, insane.
And their support was crucial. It gave those artists the freedom to keep experimenting, keep pushing boundaries.
Okay, so we've got the artists, the movements, the collectors. What about the critics? How did they react to all this?
Oh, it was a mixed bag. You had some critics who were all in. They loved this new art, like Guillaume Apollinaire.
He was a big fan of Cubism, right? And Orphism.
Yeah, he even coined the term orphism for Delaunay's work. He saw it as this totally new way of seeing the world, a fusion of light, color, movement. But on the other hand...
A lot of people hated it.
Oh, yeah, they were outraged, called it an art of the insane, a deliberate affront to good taste.
Talk about harsh reviews.
It's amazing to read those old reviews.
Where...
It shows you how much this art challenged people. It went against everything they thought art should be.
Which is what makes this whole period so interesting, right? This clash between the old and the new. All this creative energy swirling around at the same time as all these huge societal shifts.
Exactly. And it wasn't just happening in Paris. This avant-garde wave was spreading across Europe.
Like a wildfire.
Exactly. You had Die Brücke in Germany, the Expressionists, the Blaureiter, Kandinsky and his crew exploring abstraction, the Futurists in Italy with their obsession with speed and technology.
All these different movements, different languages, developing at the same time. Each one influencing the others, pushing the boundaries further.
And it all builds up to this incredible moment, right? This explosion of creativity in the years leading up to World War I. But then, of course, the war comes and everything changes.
Yeah, the war was a turning point. The optimism of the pre-war years, the experimentation, it all came to a screeching halt.
So many artists were killed.
Yeah.
Mack, Mark, Goodyear, Brzezinska, such a loss.
And those who survived, they were never the same.
Right. The war left its mark on their art, on their whole outlook on life.
It's hard to imagine the potential that was lost. But the legacy of this era, it's huge. These artists, they completely changed the art world, paved the way for everything that came after.
No doubt. So we've looked at the art, the artists, the movements, the collectors, the critics. But what about that original question, the whole mad genius thing?
Right. Was there really a link between creative brilliance and mental illness?
And after looking at all this, well, it's still a tough question.
There's no easy answer.
Not really. A lot of these artists did struggle with mental health issues. Depression, anxiety, addiction.
Like Munch, he was in and out of clinics, battled alcoholism. And his art, it's full of that anxiety, that existential dread.
And then there's Van Gogh, the classic example of the tortured artist. His struggles were very real, and his art reflects that.
But you have to remember, these were also incredibly stressful times to be alive. The world was changing so fast. Traditional values were being thrown out the window. And these artists, they were right at the center of it all.
They were pushing boundaries, breaking rules. That takes a toll on anyone.
And they face so much rejection, isolation. That can't be good for your mental health.
So it's impossible to say for sure whether there was a direct link between genius and mental illness. It's too complicated. There were so many factors involved.
But there's no denying these artists were pushing themselves to the limit, both creatively and personally.
And that intensity, that willingness to explore the darkest parts of themselves, it's what makes their art so powerful, so lasting.
It makes you wonder, though, did it burn them out? Hook seems to think that maybe that creative fire was just too intense to last. It makes you wonder, like, what was the cost? All that creative energy, all that pushing the limits, did it come with the price?
It's a good question. What happened to these guys after the war, after this insane period of creativity? Some of them, I mean, the ones who lived, their work did change. Some of it got, I don't know, more commercial. Maybe they were looking for stability after all that chaos.
It's like they lost that edge, you know, that hunger to break the rules. Did they just, like, run out of steam? Or did the world just change around them?
Tough to say. Did they adapt, or did they become, like, relics of the past? I mean, the war changed everyone, not just artists.
The whole world had gone through this trauma.
Exactly. So much destruction, so much loss. And in that context, maybe that pre-war energy, that drive to challenge everything, maybe it just wasn't possible anymore.
Like maybe it was too much to sustain.
It does make you think, what if the war hadn't happened? Would these guys have kept going? Would they have just kept pushing and pushing? Or was this whole thing, this explosion of creativity, was it always destined to burn out?
Unanswerable questions, I guess. But there's no doubt these artists changed everything. I mean, they basically redefined what art could be.
And their work still has this power to inspire, to challenge, to make people think.
So we started with this question. Is there a link between creative brilliance and mental illness? And I guess after looking at all this, talking about these artists and their lives.
And there's no easy answer, is there?
Nope. And it's complicated.
And maybe that's the point. We can analyze the art, read the biographies, but ultimately it's a mystery. What makes someone a genius? Where does creativity come from? And what role does, mental illness play? if any?
Those are questions people have been asking forever. And this period, the early 20th century, it's just full of examples that make you think about those questions.
So as you keep exploring this stuff, keep those questions in mind. Look at the art, read the stories, but don't be afraid to come to your own conclusions. There's no right or wrong answer.
And who knows, maybe you'll even discover a little bit of your own inner mad genius along the way.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into modern 10 years of genius and madness that changed art forever. We hope you enjoyed it. And we'll see you next time for another episode of the Mad Genius Thesis.